Hello, I'm John. Welcome back. As you can see, I'm sitting somewhere different today than where I usually sit. I usually sit right over there. It's not the most comfortable seat though, even though it looks pretty good on camera. It's not the most comfortable seat. You can't tell from the videos, but it's the corner of the couch, and usually I have the arm of the couch jammed into my back. I didn't feel like dealing with that today, so I thought I'd sit over here. The lighting is not particularly good in this room, regardless of where I sit. Now, I could sit with that window facing me, I suppose, but there's really nothing to look at, so it's just kind of a boring background. So, and on top of that, I don't really have anywhere to put the camera because I have a huge coffee table in the center of this room, and there's so much stuff on it, there's really nowhere to put the camera. Although, now that I have the other new thing, this microphone, which I hope is working well. I've tried it on a few videos and it seems to be working really well. My I don't talk very loud I don't speak very loudly when I do these videos, and it doesn't register very well on the camera's microphone, and I got really frustrated with that. I was having to boost the audio by 200% in some videos, and on my editing software, I just use whatever came with the computer. I didn't even know I had it till after I started making these videos. But you can only boost the audio 100%, then you have to process it, then I have to go in and do it all over again, and processing like a 30-minute video takes 15 minutes, burns up the battery on my laptop. So it's a little frustrating, so I just decided to get a microphone and see how it worked. I hope it's working well. Like I said, I've made a couple of other videos with it, and it seems to be working really well. I don't have to shout. I don't have to worry about how close the camera is to me. It's really nice. So I haven't made a reading update video in over a month. I believe it's been quite a while. And I haven't read a lot of books this month so far. I'm probably just going to talk about all the books that I've read this month so far in this video. And I can't really promise to go too far in depth in any of them for various reasons. But I don't know if I'll read any more books by the end of the month. I've been having a rather slow month. I really got tired of the grind of trying to read X amount of books in 1 month and in a year. I'm really tired of that. So I've just been taking it easy. On top of that, I was sick for the first little bit of the month and I didn't really read anything at all. And that's kind of how it was in December. I got sick. I didn't read a lot. But anyway, let's just dive right into the books. I know that's why you're here, not to hear about my seating arrangement. Now, the first book is Tomorrow is Too Far by James White. I really didn't care for this book very much. I liked the cover quite a bit. Now, I bought this about 3 or 4 months ago. My local bookstore was having a science fiction clearance sale to free up some room on their shelves, and I got this for $1. Even though I missed the sale itself, they put a whole bunch of them in the clearance racks. So this was about a guy who works at a aircraft and rocket facility where they build them and test them. He's the head of security. He becomes convinced through these little things that stand out to him about how the scientists behave, and some scraps of paper he's found and parts of unwashed chalkboards. There's a secret project going on that they don't want anyone to know about. He's really annoyed by this because he feels that as the chief security officer, he should be the one taking care of security on this project. And he starts to try to figure out what they're doing. Not so much because he cares what they're doing. He just wants to make sure that he can protect it. And in the middle of this, he becomes convinced that one of the janitors who works at the facility is a Soviet spy. This was written in the early 70s, I believe. So it's really deep into the the whole Soviet West tensions. And he learns about this janitor that he is supposedly mentally challenged. But he also finds out that he is the head uh, flying instructor at a flying club. And he is a very, very good flying instructor. And so he goes back and tries to figure out where this man came from. And he eventually, with the help of a doctor who works at the facility, is led back to a a hospital of sorts. It's a little bit of a complicated story, but they find this man on the beach, naked, and completely unable to function about 5 years before. And he couldn't speak or anything like that. They had to teach him how to speak, how to function, basically. And nobody knows where he came from. But he got better and better, and he started to learn English, and eventually he would start to wander off, and they didn't mind because he had come to the point where he could function all right, and he would come back dirty. And eventually they found out that he was going to this airport, a small airport, and the people there noticed him there, and at first they were kind of bothered because they didn't understand why this guy was just staring at them across the field. They didn't know who he was. But eventually he walked over, and he showed up every day. They started to like him, and they took him flying, and it was like something switched on in his mind, and he took control of the aircraft and was able to fly it, and they'd never seen anything like that before. So this book goes to some pretty weird places, because this project that they're testing, the man who is trying to figure out what's going on eventually figures out that they have enlisted this man that he believes to be a Soviet agent, a brainwashed Soviet agent, is going to be the test pilot on their secret project. And I'm not sure really how much to go in depth about that, but it has to do with instantaneous travel over very vast distances, but it also has to do with time travel. And that was really confusing to me. I don't think that was particularly well worked out, but on the other hand, I feel that maybe it was supposed to be a little bit ambiguous as to what was going on. I'll just go ahead and tell you, this book is 50 some odd years old, and my explaining it to you is not going to take the impact out of the book, believe me. It turns out that they're having a lot of trouble on this project because they can send someone forward in time, but when they try to send someone back in time, it completely erases their memories. And that's kind of what makes up the back end of the book. So this wasn't really my sort of thing. I liked how it started from a regular, everyday world and progressed into a strange world, if that makes sense. I've said this before, but one of my problems with reading science fiction is when it starts from a completely different world where I really don't know what's going on and I'm just completely lost. And I really liked how that this book started from our world and progressed into a strange world. It's just easier for me to connect with the book. So it is a little bit old-fashioned. Like I said, it's from 1971. But it's short, and it's interesting, and it's thought-provoking. I didn't see the ending coming. I really didn't. And it left me a bit confused. But I still enjoyed it. I wouldn't read it again, I don't think. And of course, it's not a major work of science fiction, but it's an enjoyable story. It's an enjoyable what if kind of scenario. And I will say that like I said, I didn't really care for the ending of this book. It didn't really make sense to me because I don't think that the character would have went about things the way that he did. That really didn't make sense to me. I may have just missed something there. But anyway, so after that, I didn't read too much for quite a while, probably about a week, where I barely read anything. I thought I would try to read something a little bit different from what I usually read. So I picked up Notes of a Dirty Old Man by Charles Bukowski. And this is a series of articles that he wrote in the 60s, I believe. And he portrays himself as a kind of alter ego character and just flat out makes a lot of things up too. Just fiction. But you're not really sure what's fiction and what's not. And he is indeed a dirty old man. I mean, there's a lot of sex and debauchery in this, and a lot of drunkenness and theft and all kinds of things. I only read half of this, and I thought maybe not even half of it. I wanted to get through it. I wanted to read something different. I wanted to encourage myself to expand my comfort zone, but I just couldn't connect with this book at all. There were parts of it that I was interested in and that made me laugh and that entertained me. But that drunken debauchery thing, it just doesn't do anything for me, because it just doesn't work for me. Get drunk, be lazy, just make every poor choice you can possibly make and call it art. And I don't buy that. And I've never seen that in person either. I mean, I guess Bukowski made it work for himself. It's important to remember that Bukowski really only became successful as he got older. Yeah, it just didn't really work for me, so I put it down. I don't really feel bad about putting it down. I've given Bukowski 3 or 4 chances now. I really liked his Ham on Rye. His novel Ham on Rye is really good, and I would recommend that to just about anybody. It's different from what he usually wrote. I think it's one of his earlier books. I'm not 100% sure on that, and I believe it's semi-autobiographical, but this just didn't work for me. I mean, I don't think I'll get rid of it. I think I will keep it and maybe try to read it again, but at the moment, I'm just not in the mood for it. The next book I read was Ghost Train to the Eastern Star by Paul Theroux. I really enjoyed this one. It was a follow-up to his book The Great Railway Bazaar, which he wrote in the early 70s. He took a train trip he took the Orient Express, for instance. He took trains all through India, down into Sri Lanka. He went through Myanmar and Vietnam. He went through Vietnam while the war was going on. He went to Japan, took trains all the way through Japan. He went through the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Express, and he wanted to recreate this trip. So he did as much as he could. There were some places he couldn't go because of the war in the Middle East. And I thought this was a really good book, actually. There were things about it I really liked and things about it I didn't really like. I really like train travel. I haven't ridden on very many trains in my life. I rode a few trains in Europe, and I've ridden the subway once or twice. And I don't know, it's got that romantic aspect to it, even though when you read about it, it sounds pretty miserable. Especially in the 70s when he originally took his trip. Some of the trains he took seemed really miserable and awful. But in this one of the things I really didn't like, he spent a lot of time in red light districts, in dirty bookstores. Some of the things he saw were really disturbing. And he says that one of the best ways to get a feel for the people beneath everything else is to take a look at what sort of pornography they're interested in. So we get to hear about some really weird, unpleasant things. And we also go into these red light districts, brothels, prostitutes. Everywhere he goes, basically he sees prostitutes and he talks to them. And it's not all on the up and up, and some of it is very disturbing. Some of it I'm kind of surprised he was willing to write about. He says that he had a hands-off. He didn't partake in any of that. He was just there as an observer, but I don't know. I just found those aspects of it really disturbing. And we're talking, some of it was legal, some of it was not legal. I'm kind of surprised that he wrote about some of those things, to be completely honest with you. So he did some interesting things. He went to Sri Lanka and he talked to Arthur C. Clarke. Apparently, Arthur C. Clarke moved to Sri Lanka in the late 50s or the early 60s. I wanted to know why he did that, but we really didn't get any insight into that at all. I think this was right before Arthur C. Clarke died. I believe he was in his 90s. He went to Tokyo and he spent some time with Haruki Murakami. It was really interesting because I've only read one Murakami book. It was a nonfiction book called Underground. I think it was called Underground, which is about the Aum Shinrikyo attacks on the Japanese subway system. And so that was a really interesting thing to have them having this discussion about a book I'd read and the only Murakami book I'd ever read. But they also go to some sex shops and have weird conversations in these sex shops. So the traveling aspects I really did enjoy, but he saw some really bleak, unpleasant things, which is true of all his books. In all his books, he sees some really bleak and unpleasant things, and he's not willing to cover those things up. And in a way, I really do respect that and admire that, because that's not the easiest thing in the world to do, particularly when you know that you're going to be criticized for that. But there were some things he saw in this book where I was left wondering if he tried to help these people at all, or if he just saw them and went on his way. And that made me very uncomfortable. So my favorite of Paul Theroux's books is probably Riding the Iron Rooster, which is about a year he spent living in China. This is, I would say this is probably about my third, out of the books I've read of his. I think I've read 5 or 6 now. I don't think this would be in the top 3, but it was pretty interesting, and I enjoyed it. Just like I said, there were just disturbing elements to it that kind of bothered me. I don't want to say that I don't think he was involved in anything disturbing. I'm just saying that some of the things that he witnessed were very disturbing. The next book I read was The Gathering Storm by Winston Churchill. This was really, really good, and it covers the period from the end of World War I up until the Second World War, up until the day that Churchill became Prime Minister. And this was really good because it's both a memoir and a history. It's his personal insight into the political goings-on in Great Britain, and how the victors of the First World War basically set this up to happen, not intentionally, but they had imposed these massive financial obligations upon the Germans. They had destroyed their governments, destroyed their monarchies, and left this void and this anger and resentment in the German people. And on top of that, at a certain point, they stopped enforcing the anti-military laws that they had created, so that the Germans were able to rearm, to build airplanes, to build these large battleships, and to build U-boats and stock ammunition, none of which was supposed to be legal, and that the Allied powers should have put an end to immediately, but they did not. And at the same time, the Allied powers, they were disarming themselves. They were trying to create a League of Nations. They had this sort of utopian image of a world without wars, where individual countries didn't have militaries anymore, but that at the same time they were allowing Germany to amass a military. And then once the Germans started to annex Austria and annex parts of Czechoslovakia, the peace-loving people were still trying to negotiate. And it just, you cannot negotiate with wickedness, basically, is what he says. This man is not to be negotiated with, because he will want more and more and more until he is on our shores. And that's what happened. And just really, really good. He dictated his later books, and so they have a quality of speech, of conversation, as though he's speaking directly to you. And they just flow right along. I was a little bit afraid of the political uh, parts of this book, of the strategic parts of this book, but it wasn't a problem for me at all. It flowed along. It was very, very readable. It goes on into the beginning of the war, when he was brought back as First Lord of the Admiralty almost 20 years, I think almost 25 years after he had originally been dismissed as First Lord of the Admiralty. So that was really interesting, and that must have been a very surreal moment for him to come back to that same office and that same position and that same chair. He talks about, this is the same chair that I was in, and the same maps that I put up on the wall are still there. And he had been preparing for this for 15 years at this point. He had seen it coming, and no one had listened to him, basically. And of course, that's what led him back to being prime minister eventually, is that all this time he had been saying, another war is coming. We have got to do something. We've either got to go into Germany and stop them now peacefully, or we have got to start rearming, because another war is coming. Nobody listened to him. But once the war broke out, they knew that he was willing to fight, and fight he did. And I'm really, really looking forward to getting to these other 5 volumes. And yeah, so I'm not afraid of them at all now. I think I could read right through them if I wanted to. But there are other books that I want to get to right now, so I'm going to put those on hold for a while. And really, there's no reason for me to rush through them. I know the story pretty well, and nothing is really going to be new to me. And I think these would be good books to return to maybe when I hit a slump again, because that was why I started reading this in the first place, was that I got into a reading slump, and I just made myself read a chapter a day. And I do that sometimes when I get in a slump. I make myself read a chapter a day, and usually what happens is that I go right back to reading, and that's what happened. It was supposed to take me something like 32 or 33 days to get through this, and it only took me, I think, 10 days to get through it. So I was really happy about that. The next book I read was This I Remember by Eleanor Roosevelt. This was a good book, but it was very detached. She talks about her life with Franklin Roosevelt during his time as governor of New York, and later as his time as president. He was president for 12 years. He was elected 4 times. He died shortly after he was elected for the 4th time. She talks about his relief plans in the Great Depression, how she helped out with that, not helping Franklin, but going out and trying to help people on her own, basically, using the office of First Lady. And then later on, her trips she made during World War II, a lot of the interesting people she met, a lot of the monarchs who had fled Europe, Winston Churchill, George VI, and Queen Elizabeth. A lot of people. There are a lot of names dropped in this book. She was, of course, the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. And no matter how many times she says that they had a normal family and they had a normal life, I just don't buy it. So that rang pretty hollow to me. I don't think that anyone whose uncle is the President of the United States and whose husband is the Secretary of the Navy has a very normal life, especially not later on when he becomes governor and president. It might have been normal for her, but there's a point when she talks about how they had a budget of $200,000, and this is at a time, and that they were trying to live within their means. This is at a time when people were paid $1 a day, you know? So that rang kind of hollow. All the houses that they bought and everything. I'm just trying to say that they did not have a normal life. No matter how she may say that they had a normal life, they had anything but a normal life. And what rings out loud and clear throughout this book is that she and Franklin were basically strangers to one another. And she defends him quite a bit and tries to explain away his behavior. But it's pretty clear that they had very little to do with each other. And I already knew that. I knew they were in a loveless marriage, that he had a lot of affairs and that sort of thing. But it's weird to read about. It's weird to read about a couple who is together for all this time, and to read about Eleanor Roosevelt, who supported him throughout this entire period and never says anything against him throughout this entire book, to know that she must have been deeply hurt by his behavior, but that she isn't willing to say that out loud. But it was a really good book. I don't know if I'll ever read it again. I doubt that I will. It really hasn't hurt my desire to read more about her. But I would like to see her from someone else's perspective and to get the pieces that she left out, because she left out a great deal in this book. Franklin Roosevelt may have been a great man. He may have done great things for this country. But I don't think that he was a very good friend or husband or father. And I think that rings through throughout this book, even though she tried hard to hide it. But I'd like to read more about them. I'd like to know more about them. Even though I find Franklin Roosevelt to be a hard character to read about, because he seems to be charming, but rather fake, manipulative, trying to get what he wants done. And he just seems like somebody who used everybody around him, but did it in a charming way, and so they were okay with it. And I think he used Eleanor Roosevelt too. And I think she knew it. I may be reading way too much into that. I don't know, but that's just how the book came off to me. And there are some little things about it. She does something which is very, very old-fashioned. She does a couple of things in this book which are very old-fashioned. She never uses contractions. And in that day, the upper class were taught never to use contractions. And so they have these very clunky conversations, what seem very formal and clunky conversations, where we today would use contractions and kind of smooth our phrases out, but they don't do that. And she would also refer to married women by their husbands' names. So you'll get a long list of Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Mrs. James Roosevelt, Mrs. Calvin Coolidge, Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, Mrs. Herbert Hoover. That's very old-fashioned, and if somebody were to read that today, they probably wouldn't even know what she was talking about. I first encountered that in a cookbook from the 50s. I bought a cookbook when I was about 13 or 14. It was the Fort Leavenworth cookbook from Kansas. It was just a homemade thing with metal rings keeping it together. There were, a lot of like Mrs. James Wilson or Mrs. Ed, whatever. And it was just really, it just rings really old-fashioned, particularly when it's next to phone numbers, which are like, 4 numbers long or whatever. But anyway, it was an all right book. I feel like she left out a whole lot of it. I came through it kind of feeling sorry for her. But I couldn't help but feel that maybe she held people at a distance, and you know, I don't know. It was just an interesting look into that. We very rarely think about what first ladies are doing or what their lives are like or what it must be like to be married to someone whose ambition brings them to the heights of power when perhaps you don't want anything to do with it, when you'd rather just have a normal everyday life. So it was pretty good. I would like to read the first one. It's called This Is My Story. And I've never seen that one. I was really surprised to find this one. But anyway, so I've also been reading from a few other books. I've been reading some of the stories in Compulsory Games by Robert Aickman. And they're pretty good. Aickman's stories are really weird. He specialized in the weird story. And I've also been reading some of the interviews out of this book, A Testament of Hope, The Essential Writings and Speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., edited by James M. Washington. And the interviews are really good. Now, this is a really long book, so I don't really have any plan to go through this entire book at once. But I've just been reading, bits and pieces of it here and there. It's really good. I've read letters from a Birmingham jail before, and I've read a few of the things out of this, the I Have a Dream speech and that sort of thing. It's just really good, and I've been enjoying that. And I started this book yesterday, but I don't think I'm going to read it. I might, but I'm a little bit tired of reading books that were about people from, who had been born in the Victorian era and by people who had been born in the Victorian era, and I'm kind of looking for something a little bit more contemporary. But I started The Last Voyage of the Lusitania, and this is all about the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 by a U-boat, and it's kind of what spurred the United States into getting into the First World War. This is just an account of the sinking and the people he talked. A. Hoehling and Mary Hoehling, they spoke to quite a few of the survivors of the Lusitania. They were still alive. I think this book came out of 1956. So a lot of them were still alive and they talked to them. So this would be good. I just don't think it's what I want to read right now. And so that brings us to the end. I hope my microphone has done all right. I know that I probably didn't do a very good job of explaining these books. I haven't been making these videos lately because I've been finding it very hard to talk about books. I don't know why, but nothing that I say sounds right. And yeah, I've just been finding it very hard to sum up these books and to give my thoughts on these books. So that's why I haven't been doing these wrap-up videos in quite a while. It's taken me many, many takes to get through this, and I hope that it's not too disjointed. I'm trying not to beat myself up about it or whatever, but I find it's very hard to find a nice balance between saying enough without saying too much or saying too little. So I want to thank you for watching, for putting up with my rambling and not very good explanations of these books. And like I said, I hope my microphone is all right. I'm trying to figure out how to work it and where to put it to make it sound better. And I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.